Okay, welcome everyone to the restarting of the ReproNim webinar series. It's our pleasure today to welcome our own Maryann Martone to give the presentation. I think she'll disclose that she's warming this up for a big presentation
Yes.
she has to do at Society for Neuroscience. So you'll all feel well informed if you happen to be able to see that lecture live in San Diego in a couple months. Maryann is one of the people I've worked with probably for the longest. Not that she's old, but we've been working together since the original US Human Brain Project, and then on into the BURN, the Biomedical Informatics Research Network days, and then into the Nimh and NITRIC days, and now into the ReproNim days. She's an emeritus professor of neuroscience at UC San Diego, but ever since retiring, she does even more than the infinite amount of stuff she did before retiring. So I don't know how this retirement thing really means. Maybe she'll tell us. So without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Maryann. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much for. Thank you, David, and thank you for giving me the opportunity, as David mentioned, to warm up giving the ethics lecture this year at Society for Neuroscience, and it is supposed to be on open neuroscience and neuroinformatics. So I also have to beg your indulgence because I used this opportunity to really start to think about what it was that I wanted to say, and I'm basically trying out some ideas on you and would love to hear your feedback. So this is my official title with, of course, something that references FAIR, Reflections on Progress in Open and Fair Neuroscience, because one of the things they ask you to do is actually to look back over your career and talk about your personal evolution in this area. And despite David's very polite insistence that I'm not old, actually, I'm much closer to the end of my career, having already sort of retired once and come back, than I am to the beginning. So I'm basically using this opportunity to reflect on how we got to this particular point in time. Just as a disclaimer, I am also a founder of SciCrunch.com, which is a startup company out of UCSD, and it provides services around rigorous and reproducible science and research resource identifiers. So normally when I talk about these topics, I usually have to start with a lengthy justification for why neuroscience needs to be open, why we need to share data, and why we need to share data in a fair manner. But of course, I don't really have to do that anymore because of 2023, which is coming up very rapidly when the new NIH data sharing policy is coming into effect, where NIH basically, as a on a large scale, on a whole scale, has said, you will now share your data. And unless you have some good reason not to, we understand personal health information and other things, but you are going to have to justify why you're not going to share it rather than the other way around. And I think one of the terms that I heard from Yarrow a long time ago in his paper, I couldn't find it, of course, was everything should be open by default and open by design. And NIH's policy not only says that things should be open, but that data should be fair, right? Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And there is an emphasis on data management this time, right? That data must be managed in a way that would allow us to achieve this goal. So that's something I'm going to pick up later on. So this is a sweeping change. And it is interesting when one looks back over one's career at what finally brought us here. I wish I had more graphics ability, and I will try to make this better by the time Society for Neuroscience comes around. But I was thinking of all the different threads and trends that happened over, let's say, the early 90s when I started my career, and now that brought us to what arguably can say is a wholesale paradigm shift in the way that we publish our work and what is expected of us. But there were multiple trends that actually were happening, or multiple streams. And I was sort of blessed to jump back and forth between these streams at various times as my career progressed. So David mentioned some of them, right? There was a big push starting in the early 1990s, 1993, with something called the US Human Brain Project that was led out of NIMH. And I'm going to talk a lot about that, so I won't go into this now, but that really laid the groundwork for neuroinformatics. And in fact, I think Stephen Kozlow, who ran this, claimed that he coined the term neuroinformatics. The Europeans said, no, we used to use that term for something else, but we don't need to get into that. But there were certainly seminal things that happened over the course of it. And I've basically only picked the ones that I myself was either involved in or I thought were particularly noteworthy. For example, in 1999, we had the fMRI Data Center. That's where Jeff came from, Jeff Greta, my colleague. But that was also one of the first attempts to tie data sharing to journal publication. And therefore, I think it was very notable. The Biomedical Informatics Research Network, or BIRN, was a very influential project. That's where David and I met, and a lot of where a lot of the cadre of people who are now considered leaders in the field of neuroinformatics got their training. And it's interesting, and maybe I'll touch on this, that the HBP and BIRN were not considered successful. That is, they were taking on things that perhaps were ahead of their time, and perhaps in some objectives they did not succeed, but in other objectives they succeeded quite magnificently in bringing us to the point we are now. The International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility was founded roughly around 2005. David already mentioned the Neuroscience Information Framework and NITRIC projects were roughly around 2008. And then we see in open neuroscience, there was not very much going on, I would say, up until the early 2000s. And then as a result, I think, of a lot of the work that went on in the neuroinformatics community, we started to have people who prospectively would gather data sets to be shared, the Human Connectome Project, the ABCD project, and there were many, many, many others in there, culminating, I think, in declarations by the large International Brain Project somewhere around circa 2014 and others, that if they were going to be collecting data, they were going to be collecting data and making it open. So neuroscience went, I would say, underwent an enormous shift from being, I would say, pretty hostile to data sharing in the beginning, even though recognizing, some recognized that this was coming, into embracing it on a large scale, even ahead of the NIH declaring it institute-wide. But this was not the only place that we were going into. In fact, neuroscience was fairly insular in its interactions. There were huge forces going on outside of neuroscience that were often referred to. For example, the declaration by the genomics community that they were going to immediately release their data even before they published a paper. They were going to put that data out. Open access journals started to come out in the early 2000s, where it was recognized that people do need to be able to access the data or the information, and that they shouldn't be behind paywalls. Organizations such as Force 11 and Research Data Alliance started to really tackle this new forms of communication starting in around 2012. The reproducibility crisis impacted everybody as people realized that the results of science perhaps were not as reliable as they could be. And the fair data principles, for example, came out of this whole open science community. These had a huge impact, as you saw, on NIH and others in their data sharing policies. We also have to recognize that there were these very large technology changes that were going on. And I put 1969 for the protein data bank, just to recognize that people were using computers to store data, community data, for a very long time. And the structural biology community out of Brookhaven had already established a database that said all your protein structures need to go in here. And that, of course, has continued up until this day and has been a huge source of information for things like Google's DeepMind and trying to do drug discovery and other sorts of things. Personal computers started to come in. We could exchange information on floppy disks. The internet, of course, was a huge disruptive technology that really started people thinking about wholesale ways of changing the way that we communicate our scientific results. The BIRN project was built on something called the grid, this idea that you do not manage everything locally, but things, compute cycles and also storage can be distributed and you can access those. And then, of course, that morphed into the cloud, really picked up by commercial entities and giving us a robust infrastructure where we no longer now thought of having things just on our local computers, but that we had almost instantaneous access to compute cycles and data from around the world. So these are just all the different trends that all sort of came together. And I wanted to kind of go through a few of them and almost take a historical approach as to how I think we ended up here and all the different threads that had to tie together for that to happen. And I want to start with the NIMH Human Brain Project. Of course, you may all be familiar with the European HBP, which was launched roughly around 2013 and 2014. But I always say that this was the first Human Brain Project. And it was named to be parallel, right, with the Human Genome Project. The idea that all of a sudden we were going to go from a cottage industry where we managed all our data locally and we produced tools for ourselves, maybe we bought some of them off the shelf, to embrace the fact that we now had the internet, we had ways of being able to share our data and manage our data in ways that we hadn't before. And this is from a 2000 paper from Steve Kozlow, where he sort of laid out a vision for neuroinformatics, or what the vision was. Of course, it started back in 1993. And it envisioned a world where there was going to be immediate storage of experimental data and background information in a standardized digital form, so that it's basically available to the individual investigator and then after publication to other researchers. Even then, they recognized that trying to create a centralized resource like GenBank or the PDB for neuroscience was not going to work. We had too many different data types, we had too many different model systems, so on and so forth. And so really, they envisioned that there would be a federation of distributed databases that would more or less cover neuroscience. They said they should be web accessible, because remember back then those arguments weren't completely settled, but they envisioned that all of this data, this federated data, would be accessed through a neuroscience portal using a smart neuroscience browser instructed to look for particular variables or sets of variables and import those data back to the user's computer, right? So the idea that there was remote computing, I think, wasn't yet on the horizon. And that you could compare results from different levels of analysis and different data types and different fields. They would all be combined and compared so that we would have true knowledge discovery in neuroscience based on integrative science. And this was really going to require that we have a new paradigm of interdisciplinary collaboration, where neuroscientists were going to have to interact with engineers, computer science, mathematicians, and physicists. And that was actually the premise of the BERN project. It said, I'm sorry, we got to get the computer scientists and the biologists to talk to each other, and that they're going to need to learn each other's languages and understand their questions and approaches. And you might think that that is simple now, but believe me, that was a long process trying to get us to be able to speak the same language. And I'm not sure that we even do that even today. And it was interesting that they thought about how this was going to, new paradigm was going to be established. And I thought it was very interesting that Steve said that even though NIH might in principle require their grant recipients to deposit primary data, he thought that this would be counterproductive at that point. He said the new paradigm would work only if it evolves from a shared consensus within the worldwide scientific community. And journals might be able to do this, right? But even then, it's not going to really be any use unless there's standards that allow this data to be useful. But he saw some hope. He said efforts are underway now to lay this basic groundwork for a paradigm shift in which primary research data are openly shared. But without incentives for cooperation and sharing, they knew that this was not really going to take off. So I think it actually fairly effectively lays out back then in the early days where it was that neuroscience needed to go, and also some of the barriers for that. So I think it is interesting that as I started to prepare for this lecture and I looked back in my own slides and also what was going on in the wider community at that point, I think various times there have been evolving arguments for data sharing in neuroscience. So you note back in 2000 and in the 90s, it was really about a personal benefit to you, right? That you would be able to manage your data, you'd be able to integrate it, you would be able to do your work better because you would have access to other people's data. They knew that incentives had to be there in terms of your own career. And that was sort of the tack that they took. And that neuroscience, whether we liked it or not, needed this, right? They needed to be able to go across these different data types, because we all agreed, right, that neuroscience was perhaps one of the most integrative of all sciences. And if we didn't have that, we weren't going to be able to get there, right? So you'd be able to carry out pilot experiments. This would be more efficient. You wouldn't need to use as many experimental animals. You could build better models. But over time, I think largely in the open science world, leading to things like PLOS, arguments about the public good really started to come in. And this was more, not just discovery science that says, yes, we can impact human health, but it was also, taxpayers paid for these scientific studies. And even though that they now had a distribution mechanism where they could get to these things and could get to data, citizen scientists, for example, or just interested parties. In fact, you couldn't because they were behind paywalls. And this really caused people to question everything about our current scientific communication systems. Starting though around 2009, 2010, 11, 12, reproducibility started to become paramount. And people started to realize that the way that we were doing our science, the way we were communicating it, everything, what we were incentivized to do was not really serving science particularly well. And all of a sudden, motivations for open science and data sharing came beyond your own personal benefit. And wow, I think this is going to do something great for science to, I'm sorry, it's not working the way it's going, and we need to change here. And then interestingly, as big data, data science, AI, all of those things made a renaissance as the compute got better, the algorithms got better. We started then again to start thinking about the promise, right? It's not only that we can transparently inspect somebody else's results, but that we need to use computers to really help us drive discovery science. And so you can see, I put this linearly just because it's a nice graphic, but it's not linear. These things were all sort of percolating around at the same time. And you could actually see that in my presentations. If I looked early in my presentations, I had, well, you know what, we kind of need this because we have all of this data and neuroscience has to be able to integrate things. I was in an imaging center and we knew that we had MRI coming out and we had electron microscopy, protein structure, and that the only way we were ever going to be able to put these together was by using computers. Okay, I think people would agree on that in principle, but it wasn't a very persuasive argument. But then I noticed I started to adopt a little bit of a more moralistic tone, right? Where I said, I used to feel that I had to justify asking people to shift the way that they do things towards more open data tools and transparency. But now I started to say, I'm sorry, you need to justify to me why it is, and to the public, why it is you're insisting on doing things the same way when neuroscience has really not had much of an impact, right? We haven't had as much impact as we want on mental health, neurodegenerative diseases, neurotrauma. It's not that there's been no progress, and certainly, the news every day gives us more hope that maybe we have some effective treatments, but overall, certainly in that mid-2000 the teens, right, the impact that we had really was minimal. And I think, in fact, took some of these quotes from David Kennedy, one of his slides. And so, we knew the fact that we were publishing small, underpowered studies that were not using sound statistical principles and other sorts of things was a real problem. And so I started to adopt this tone saying, I'm sorry, you're going to have to justify to the public why you think doing things the way you're doing it now is effective. And I think there was a really nice story. I wanted to share at least one story out of the spinal cord injury community that really kind of reflected all of these motivations for why one would want to share data. And those of us who are old enough remember that back in 2000, Christopher Reeve, of course, who had suffered a catastrophic spinal cord injury in an equestrian event, actually came and spoke to the Society for Neuroscience. And he really exhorted the community to do better. He goes, I'm sick and tired of watching rats recover from spinal cord injury. And in various interviews, this was an interview published after his death, he said, I think I could bear the slow progress if it were just a matter of science, but I can't tolerate it if we're being held back because of politics and money. I think he was thinking of external politics, but I think the politics and incentive systems that were in place in science at that time were not working to his advantage. But interestingly enough, there was a huge change and huge shift in the spinal cord injury community after this. And I wanted to just walk you through a really remarkable story. I called it a data sharing success story in 3 acts, because many of you may be familiar with the data sharing tragedy in 3 acts. There may not actually be 3 acts, but that's okay. And this is really the work of Dr. Adam Ferguson at UCSF, one of my colleagues, and that wider community. So basically, I like to say that spinal cord injury took the reproducibility issue by the head. And long before independent third parties were out there trying to replicate studies like the Center for Open Science, spinal cord injury at the behest of NIH actually set up a replication project. Why was it that so many things were working in the laboratory with rats, but were not working in the clinic? And they tried to replicate the major studies in spinal cord injury. This was published in 2012. And as you can see, not a good record. There was one clear replication. Most of them were either partial or no replications at all. Adam Ferguson, was a young professor at that point. And, he really kind of pointed out, he goes, look, if you're trying to go into all of your data and make any sense out of it, good luck. This is what somebody trying to understand spinal cord injury would be confronted with. And there's no sort of major insight there. There's very nothing you can do. And there's a great quote by Michael Nielsen in Reinventing Discovery: an unaided human's ability to process large data sets is comparable to a dog's ability to do arithmetic and not much more valuable, right? This is a hard integration problem, and the way that we were publishing things didn't help. So this is another thing I stole from David Kennedy, where he said, you know what, meta-analysis really needs to be replaced by mega-analysis. And it's interesting that one of the main objections to data sharing in spinal cord injury is they're like, well, there's no problem. You just have to go in and do a meta-analysis. But I actually dug up a quote from Gene Glass, one of the fathers of meta-analysis. And he basically said, it was created out of the need to extract useful information from the cryptic records of inferential data analyses in abbreviated reports of research, but it needs to be replaced by archives of raw data that permit the construction of complex data landscapes that depict the relationships among independent, dependent, and mediating variables. And Adam, as a young statistician, that's exactly what he did. The spinal cord injury community knew that they were facing these reproducibility issues, and rather than running away from them, they basically took all their data and dumped it on Adam's desk, because this is fairly early, and said, please see if you can do something with it. So he was able to construct a data set that he called Vision SCI that comprised about 60 million data points from 3,500 animal and human records, right? These were different studies that were underway. And the interesting thing is that by using various multivariate statistics, he created something which he called the syndromic space, which I thought was interesting. That said, if you start to put all of these data together, and it wasn't easy, you start to see interactions amongst multiple measures, things that correlate together, which you would not be able to see in any individual experiment. Even if you replicated that experiment, you wouldn't be able to see it because you have to fill in this complex multidimensional space. And as soon as I heard Adam talk about this, I immediately embraced it, because I said, yes, right, we have to embrace data and variability instead of trying to suppress it. And just replicating individual studies was not going to be enough. And the spinal cord injury community recognized this. He was able to come up with biomarkers and predictive models that were actually reproducible, but the reproducibility wasn't in individual experiments, it was in this space. And I like this quote from one of his colleagues who said, one of my most important contributions to SCI was sharing data from a failed experiment, because you would put those in there too, as well. So this was interesting, and it was an interesting finding, but Adam really has continued on this track. And it turned out that some of that data was part of a larger study called the Mascus study that was done in the 90s, looking for it was a drug trial to see whether or not there was something that was going to be effective for spinal cord injury. It failed. It was preclinical research. No result was detected. But Adam had some of that data in that Vision SCI, and being in San Francisco, he came in contact with some data scientists who were studying advanced algorithms, and they had something called advanced topological analysis. I can't say that I understand exactly what it is, but analyzing that data showed something very interesting, that in fact, there were different responses that you could see, some animals that recovered well, some that didn't recover well, and that you could throw in all those variables and things that were in there. The ones that seemed to correlate, interestingly enough, were blood pressure during surgery. They found a very strong correlation in this initial data set between the blood pressure that was being maintained during surgery on these animals and their eventual outcomes. So what did they do? They decided they were going to replicate this, not with new data, but they were going to go and recover the full MASCI study or MASCA study. That was in a set of boxes in warehouses in Newark. They actually went into data. You could argue that this was well-managed data. It just wasn't digital. They recovered that and they reran the analysis with this larger sample, and they found a successful replication. There was a range of blood pressures that were maintained, that if were maintained, were associated with much more successful outcomes. In the meanwhile, there had been a large effort to create clinical data from spinal cord injury patients through Jeff Manley and his group, also at UCSF, in a study called Track SCI. And Adam had access to that data. So he said, I'm wondering if we can take this data that we saw from the MASCA study and replicate it in humans. And remarkably, that's what they found, that there was in fact a range of blood pressures that during surgery for spinal cord injury were associated with a much better outcome than than if you did not maintain it, if it was either too high or too low. And this actually has made it all the way into the clinic. UCSF actually now uses that range in their new guidelines when people come with spinal cord injury. They are a class 1 trauma center, and they've had some remarkable successes. Blood pressure wasn't the only thing, and this is UCSF perhaps hyping it, but they do credit this new guideline that all came from existing data that was reanalyzed using new methods from data that had been thought to be failed. And so I think it's really a quite remarkable story. It's a major impetus, and you can see in there all those different motivations, the reproducibility science, the promise of AI and new algorithms, all of those things coming together to lead to something that may have a very large impact. But of course, the spinal cord injury community knew that you could do better perhaps than raiding a warehouse. And so this led to a project that Jeff and I are involved in, the Open Data Commons for Spinal Cord Injury. And one of the first data sets that was released to the public was this Vision SCI and MASCUS data, so that other people also have access to it and can replicate that, or perhaps find new things in there that they hadn't found before. So I thought that it was interesting to sort of place all this in context, because a lot of times we, as I said, we have an obligation to do better if we can. You'd like to show some evidence that actually we can do better. And I think studies like that go all the way from basic neuroscience all the way to clinical practice are in fact very, very powerful. So I like to show that. Also, I know this is a neuroimaging group, and I thought it would be interesting to bring something in from something other than neuroimaging. But I want to get back in the second part of the talk to this vision thing and see how we are doing relative to what it was that neuroinformatics laid out all those years ago in the early 1990s. So I thought I would revisit some of those predictions, right? Creation of centralized neuroscience database is a formidable task. A much better approach is to establish a variety of smaller scale initiatives in which individual neuroscientists work with information scientists to create databases relevant to their own research. I think you saw that in the spinal cord injury community. And I think that that has been a successful strategy. In fact, if you look at where we are from those early days, neuroscience now, not just through investments in HBP, although some of the things that were established then are still going, but larger investments worldwide, especially in the large brain initiatives, have really led to a series of robust infrastructures for storing most, I wouldn't say 100%, data types that are being produced in neuroscience. And these have gotten better. So I was looking at some of my early slides, and this is an interface from a database that we set up in early 2000s, and I was very proud of it at the time. But in fact, we really didn't know anything about user interface design. We didn't know anything about how to do this. We were all on our own. There really weren't consistent guidelines for how one built these repositories. And I'm comparing it now to the sort of sophistication and robustness and sets of features that we now know need to go into these repositories. And this is the Spark project, which I'm also involved in, that is storing data related to the autonomic nervous system. So I think we've come a really long way, and that has been the community at large, understanding that if one is going to run a scientific infrastructure, it's not something you do on the side, just letting your colleagues share things, but that this is really a professional obligation, and that there are things that you need to do and need to do well. The second area I think we did really well in is that we really needed to forge and create this interdisciplinary community. Neuroinformatics is not just neuroscientists, but it's computer scientists, engineers, physicists, mathematicians, everybody that Steve had envisioned way back when. And I think the start in the HBP, where we used to have our annual meetings, that once this project was discontinued, was really taken up by the INCF and organizations like OHBM, really did succeed in establishing an international network of neuroinformaticians and cross-disciplinary sciences. As I said, it took a long time because talking to people in other disciplines isn't easier, but I think that everybody would agree that when neuroscience was ready to embrace open neuroscience and large-scale sharing, a lot of people who kind of came up through HBP, INCF, and these other organizations, Russ, David, Satya, and others, were all ready to take on this challenge and helped field the infrastructure so that people didn't start from scratch. So I think that that has been very successful. This one is interesting that Steve backed off on data sharing mandates. And he said, really, it would only work if there was a shared consensus within the worldwide community that things had to change. And I think that it was interesting, again, in the early 2000s, late 90s, that people around the world started to get together and really say, you know what, we're not happy about the way things are going. There's a lot of things that are wrong that need to change. We need to change the culture around this. We need to change scholarly communications. And I mentioned that a little bit in my timeline, that there were huge things going on in the open science and open scholarly communications area. And this was a slide I had prepared for Force 11 that I think directly speaks to Steve's comment here. If you looked in this period, there were over 100 sets of declarations that were put out by different groups working around the world. And they were all asking for a type of change. And that change was always towards open. It was always towards open, and it was towards incentive changes and other things that would make it, that would basically transform the way that we are communicating science. I'm sorry, my cat is coughing in the background and it's distracting me. And that, led directly to organizations like Force 11, which stands for the Future of Research Communications and e-Scholarship, because they really wanted to accelerate this change, this pace. What is it that they wanted to say, we don't have to do things the same way. There are a lot of misincentives, misaligned incentives. We need to be able to change those. And if you looked at all of those declarations, they were actually laying out, even though they were separate declarations by separate groups of people motivated by separate use cases, they were all really saying, right, that open things need to be open, and that what needs to be open is more than just publications. It's more than just open access, but it needs to be open code, and it needs to be open data, open workflows, open everything, right? That basically all of these things encapsulate almost every argument that was put forward for data sharing, and that you had to pay attention to how you did this. And so you had to make things fair. You had to make them findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It wasn't just enough to say, hey, this is available on request, but you needed to make it available in that sort of digital world. And you had to pay attention to things like tracking and citation, right? That it wasn't enough that you put these out there, but you needed to get credit. Our credit system had to expand beyond how many publications and grants you got to also how much data you put out and how much code you put out and whether people could reuse this. And that the idea that these would all sort of work together, right? So that it wasn't just little islands out there, but that you would be able to cross over to different areas depending on your needs. It was sort of embedded in the word ecosystem, I think. So bringing this back to neuroscience, I would say that during my years in the Force 11 community, that was roughly 2011 to about 2016 or 17, I really noted how insular neuroscience was, how few people in neuroscience were really working across these other domains. They tended to stick to neuroscience. David and some of the people from HBP were interested in these things, but by and large, most neuroscientists didn't care. And I would say that neuroscience was actually relatively late to the table for groups getting together and saying, yes, we need to change things. If anyone talked to your average neuroscientist during that period, once you sort of start working in open, when you go back, and I used to say, when I go back and talk to the neuroscience community, it was like somebody put a wall down, right? It was like, oh, wait, we have no points of shared understanding here. And more often than not, you're met with hostility. But clearly things were working underneath the surface, because starting with the large brain projects and the brain plans for Brain 2025 and other things, there was a recognition that these primary research data do need to be openly shared with worldwide neuroscience community. And so almost all of the big brain initiatives were built on the fact that data was going to be pushed out, data and tools were going to be pushed out to the neuroscience community. So even though I think neuroscience was a little late, they did end up embracing this wholesale. Okay, so those were some things that we did well. What were some things that perhaps we didn't do so well? Well, they basically, the vision said, we're going to have all these distributed databases and they're going to be federated. And the idea that you would be able to query across these federated database, and that you would be able to integrate all this data together, because you would be able to go from one thing to the next and integrate molecules and brain imaging and all that other, every other scale in between, was always sort of baked into the idea of why we had to do neuroinformatics. So did we achieve this? I would say not so much. This is an area where we are still really struggling, I would say. There's been fits and starts in projects. And one of those, of course, was the Neuroscience Information Framework, which really was conceived of by the NIH Blueprint precisely for this reason. It says, you know what, we're creating all these databases, and turns out there were already thousands of them by the time we started to catalog them in 2006, but everybody's making their own. We know we need to query across these. Can we query across these? How can we use them? And my colleagues, Dr. Nita Bandrowski and Jeff Grada, and I ran the Neuroscience Information Framework. It's still up there, but it was actively funded from 2008 to, I think, 2016. And our job was to catalog and look across things and say, you know what, we're going to try to make these cross-queryable. So we had technology that came out of Yale that let us query inside of databases. So you could go to Nimh and you could issue a query. But because everything was done in a different way, it was actually very hard to do that. So for example, almost immediately, we had to confront the fact that no two databases used the same neuroanatomical nomenclature, making it very difficult to be able to query across it. And we actually did an analysis of this, where we looked at all of these different databases that at the time we had that had connectivity information. And we actually looked to see how many of these databases used the exact same term, and only found 42 terms that were the same across the databases. The vast majority of these 1,800 were unique. Some of them could be related through semantic relationships, but most of them could not. It's just that everybody used different nomenclatures. They were not just species specific, they were across the same atlases that were in, for example, human. And this has turned out to be a real barrier, as you can imagine, because if there were no shared understanding for how to do this, it becomes very difficult to query. So digging through my slides way back when, I actually found that we had put out NIF's minimum requirements for effective data sharing. And I actually regret that we never published this, because it actually, as you can see, echoes of the FAIR data principles. Number one is you and the machine have to be able to find it, right? So it's not just that you know it's there, but that there's some global search that you could go through and say, hey, there's a database over here that has this type of information. It has to be accessible through the web. You need to annotate it, needs to use common vocabularies. You have to be able to use it. The data type has to be specified and in a usable form. And you have to know what the data means. You have to have some semantics. You have to have context. You have to have provenance. And as I mentioned, these types of things were being experienced by all of us, like Nimh and in other domains, who were trying to query and look across data on the web and say, can we make sense of it? Can we use this? And this led to a group in 2014. Force 11 didn't create the FAIR principles, but all of the people who were involved in Force got together and they issued something that says, you know, if we're going to do this, right, we need to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And as I said, you can see the echoes of these principles in what Nimh found, but it's not surprising of that because, as I said, everybody who was working on this all experienced the same thing. They said, we can't find anything, we can't access it. Even if we access it, we can't put it together, and we certainly can't reuse it. We used to find things in Nimh where people would share spreadsheets, but they would share a JPEG of a spreadsheet. So basically you could look at it, but you really couldn't do anything of it, right? It really sort of exposed how difficult these things were. So of course, I'm not going to go into all the FAIR data principles now, but you know that there are things like globally unique identifiers, rich metadata, domain standards, and all of that. Fortunately, I would say in neuroscience, we had an organization, the INCF, who was really primed to be able to take this on for neuroscience, because a lot of these things really require community interpretation. If you look here, it says metadata must meet domain relevant community standards. Well, how do you know what a community standard is? And so around this time, 2016, when I came really back into neuroscience and became re-engaged with the INCF, we also started to talk a lot about FAIR. And we recognized that if we were going to deal with FAIR, we had to attack the repositories and the registries, and we had to attack the researchers as well and give them, interpret FAIR for them, coordinate around FAIR. And INCF, I think, has done a really good job on it. INCF started to, instead of just getting groups together to be able to work on standards, they also started to review and endorse them to make sure that they were usable. They've created a large catalog of reviewed and endorsed standards that say you can count on these standards and incorporate them into your practice. So that's one thing that they did. Here's an example of the catalog where it shows you which standards have been endorsed. It provides you information on how to use them, and also tells you about competing standards. So it's a very, very powerful tool. JP Pauline of JB of ReproNim is also leading the charge at INCF as the chair of the Council on Training Science and Infrastructure on creating a FAIR roadmap. So really saying, you know, what is it that we need to do to sort of progressively embrace FAIR so that as a whole, neuroscience infrastructures and neuroscience moves towards more fair access. So the SBP portfolio is one thing. They also recently released a set of recommendations for those who are fielding this independent infrastructure, right? Here are the things that you need to do in order to be able to make your neuroscience repository fair. So they're taking very proactive steps. Oops, I'm just keeping track of the time. So they're taking very proactive steps to make sure that they are coordinating these distributed databases. And I think as we start to embrace FAIR and embrace the standards, that very tricky, challenging prospect of actual data federation and this cross query, not superficial query, but a deep query where you would be able to select cohorts from distributed databases will finally become a reality. But that just took a while, and it took a lot of different trends coming together to sort of lay out how one goes about doing this and for the community to actually embrace it. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about where we're going next and looking at some of the things that, again, were laid out in 1993 and the following years about attitudes towards data sharing and how that new policy is really going to impact the practice of neuroscience. So I come back again to those statements. We need that shared consensus in the worldwide scientific community, and there need to be incentives for cooperation and sharing that are greater than the costs. So I wanted to spend, as I mentioned, that's 40 minutes, just a few minutes talking about some trends that I think are very positive in this area. So first of all, attitudes towards data sharing may be more positive, but at least as of right now, ahead of this new data sharing mandate, things are moving relatively slowly. So here, for example, are trends in clinical neuroscience. Somebody did an analysis of how much data was available in papers associated with papers, and you can see it went from 39% to 42%. That's good. But a large percentage of it still isn't shared, despite the fact that journals have policies for doing so. One of the things I found a little disturbing, though, was that if you look at how most of this data was shared, it was shared in the text of a paper or supplementary material. So it really wasn't shared in a fair way, as neither one of those, right, is particularly useful. I also did an analysis of archives. In 2014, we had published a paper where we documented at the time number of data sets that were in a lot of the archives that were available at the time, right? These have subsequently changed. And you can see positive trends. Neuromorpho in particular, which has neuron reconstructions, has exploded and become the go-to repositories if you're going to do neuroscience reconstructions. Figshare, which is a generalist repository, has a lot of neuroscience stuff in there. This is not all data. A lot of it is slides and other sorts of things. But yes, neuroscientists are contributing. But in other areas, there's been positive trends, roughly doubling of model DB, but still, I would say compared to the amount of data that is produced, it's relatively modest. And that sort of jives with the fact that many scientists, to quote Richard Nakamura of NIH, still think of data sharing as a form of tax on their systems in terms of extra effort and cost. They really aren't embracing this and are not going all in. And those attitudes really reflect things like, oh, okay, I'll do it because the journal's making me do it and funders are making me do it. So I'm going to put a JPEG of an Excel spreadsheet in the supplementary material. A lot of fear around sharing their data, and also a lot of ignorance. It's like, I don't know what to share. I don't know how to share it. I can't get credit for it. So I was fortunate back in 2021 to chair the workshop run by the National Academies that was on the new NIH data sharing policy. And the name of it was really changing the culture about data management and sharing. The mandate gives a stick to say you are going to do this, but there was a real desire that it not be done in a way that is not useful. That is why NIH, I think, put FAIR in there as well, right? You have to pay attention to your data. You have to share it in a way that is usable. You're not allowed to just throw it over the transom and say, gee, there it is. So I wanted to just review very briefly, like a theme that really percolated that I throughout the workshop that I think is really relevant to ReproNim. Several speakers really said that the focus on the changing of the culture should not be on the individual, but on the laboratory, that the laboratory is really the unit of data sharing. Scott Fraser had a great quote that said, if we can share data in the lab, then there's something worth sharing outside of the lab. It was recognized that most laboratories have a very ad hoc approach to data sharing, and it's just the way they do things, but they're really not managing their data with the idea that they are going to be sharing it. And perhaps the leap in incentive is too big if you're going to share it with some anonymous third party like Adam, who's going to do something with it. But you should think about sharing it with your future self, and you should think about sharing it with your PI, and you should think about sharing it with your colleagues when you want to. And the reason why that is currently hard, this came also from Scott Fraser and Carl Kesselman's group, is that we typically think of data sharing as something that we only do at the end of a project, when in fact, during all of these stages, we should be managing our data like we're going to be able to share it with our colleagues, our PIs, our future self, if I happen to come back a year later. And Carl Kesselman made this interesting point, which says when data sharing occurs as an afterthought, perhaps only due to requirements imposed by a publisher or sponsor, it really does provide no value to the researchers during the performance of their research, and thus is often poorly executed. So he is really focusing on the fact that we should be outfitting our laboratories to manage data in a fair way at every step, and stop thinking about it as something that you go ahead and hunt down data that's distributed across notebooks, laptops, cloud storage, local storage systems with inadequate metadata, and try to reconstruct this ad hoc. That is a tax on you and a burden on you, but it shouldn't be. And if you manage your data correctly, it should really be a benefit to all the people that I mentioned. So of course, ReproNim is integrally involved in this and really has laid out a set of standards and technologies that allow you inside of your laboratory to manage, annotate your data standards-based in a fair way, in a way that makes it very easy to go back and forth between local data stores and public repositories, both if you want to use public data and if you want to share your data. And so I think that all of those investments, again, are leading to environments like this, but it's work and it's going to require money. This is just an IDM. And I thought Jan Bialy made a very interesting statement at this workshop. He said there are two types of researchers: those who do not invest in data management in the laboratory, who publish a lot of papers, and those who do invest in data management, who build a foundation of shared data in the lab that can be built on. So they may take a short-term hit in productivity, but over the long run, they should be more productive and their science should be more robust and sound. So it's interesting, oops, I don't want that to play, that just a few months ago, I received a preprint from Keith Bush, a neuroimager, who said that he used the pandemic to actually embrace everything about open science and FAIR, including the reproducible neuroimaging pipelines of ReproNim, and started to implement them in his laboratory. And he published a paper about his experiences and made statements like, yes, it took a long time for us to map to BIDs, but the benefits of mapping to BIDs far exceed the costs. He had now had access to software. It made it easier for him to develop his own software. And he created this nice table where he said, here are all the steps that were involved, and here was the cost to us and the perceived benefit. And he was very honest about it, right? For example, creating data dictionaries he found in the short run was very, very hard, was a little bit, provided a little bit of benefit because there was more of a shared understanding in the lab, but the immediate benefit was fairly low. However, that's got asterisks because he said he's anticipating in the future that it will lead to much greater ones. But I think this type of cost benefit analysis in the area of data management is going to be the next frontier, and also where neuroscientists and others are being supported in their desire to outfit and retrofit their laboratories for proper data management that over time will pay big dividends. So this was just one final thing on the value of proposition of FAIR for non-data scientists. We've been finding, and there were a lot of anecdotal sharing of this in the workshop, that a lot of researchers, once they manage things in an open repository, actually go back and forth to that repository a lot. That is the one that seems to benefit the most from putting that data in public repositories are the researchers themselves. And as they are forced to do this, if they do it well, they start to appreciate, and we've had several converts in ODC and other places in Spark, where they're like, wow, I can communicate my own data to my own group better than I could before. So people are starting to realize these. So I do actually think that this is a real hook that needs to be exploited. Oops, I see we're almost done, so I'm not going to cover data citation. But I just want to say that I honestly believe if you look at all of these trends coming forward, there was a lot of work by a lot of people, a lot of things that had to happen around the world, but we really are entering a new era for open and fair science. There's an opportunity here with the mandate now to bring along those who in the past were skeptical or didn't want to do it. And it's incumbent upon us who run these infrastructures to show them the value. And I think data management and helping with data management like ReproNim did is really one of those places where we blur the lines between private sharing and public sharing in a way where the benefits are almost immediately available. Challenges remain. Usability of our infrastructures isn't quite so good. I think customer service needs to be improved. The attitudes of researchers towards their data have to change. They have to value it as a product instead of as an appendage that gets stuck onto a paper. I think studies like Adam really show why that is not the case. But I think the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good, and we will learn by doing. And I didn't actually put everybody's name down on this slide because I didn't want to leave anybody off, but I will by neuroscience. But I just want to acknowledge to all of those fellow warriors who came along from the Human Brain Project and survived all these burn and all of the other projects that sometimes didn't go as well. But all of those things were necessary to bring us to this point, and I only have optimism for the future. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you,
I think I
Maryann.
made it in time.
that was a tour de force, all sorts of history and important things that I appreciate being laid out here.
Oh, good. As I said, it won't be the talk, but I was hoping that some of the themes would resonate, and it was fun to go down memory lane.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience?
Mm-hmm.
I have some applause to start off with.
Oh,
that was a great talk, actually. I think, yeah, it has so much energy. And I think that, I mean, I came from basic, wet lab neuroscience, and I actually think that the history that you present And the references are really fundamentally important to getting to those folks who, who still work, in the lab, because it's a little, unless they happen to be connected to a lab that's doing this kind of work, it still has a lot of foreign element to it. And I think that seeing it laid out really simplifies. It allows you to focus on what the issues actually are. So I actually think it's extremely valuable.
Oh, good.
And it's engaging, like the pace is very engaging. So I have one, this isn't a question, actually, it's a comment. As I was listening along, I thought, I actually really love the pace, but there's one particular point about the meta versus the mega analysis, which I think is actually fundamentally important. And and I actually felt like, oh, if you could have 2 more sentences about that, just to make sure that people are paying attention to what the difference is when you say it. It's really relevant to the things that come, especially for the wet lab folks, I think.
Okay. I will heighten that. Okay.
Yeah, it's just a 2 cents, but I really liked it.
Oh, good. Thank you. That actually makes me feel better, because last week I'm like, I don't have any idea what I'm going to say.
It's very engaging.
There's like so many options, but I really feel that the data sharing mandate just sort of reframes it all. And I really want to kind of get that out there, that it's like, you can agree or disagree, but it doesn't matter. But it's still, even though I thought it was interesting that Steve had sort of said, you know what, we could try to enforce this. And let's face it, I think a lot of us were advocating for that, right? Way back when, David, we're like, well, no one's going to put their data in until the funders mandate it.
Right.
But actually looking at the evolution of the infrastructures and everything else, we are in a much better place to do that now. And I think if everyone had said to every researcher back in, let's say, 2001, okay, all your data is going to go in the databases, we wouldn't have been able to handle it anyway, right? I mean, I think that that's really true. So I almost think that everything sort of happened the way it needed to, but we never lost faith and we never lost hope, right? We just kept going. We kept going. And that's what I think allowed us to all, to come to this spot. So that's another point I really want to make, that had we not done that, when neuroscience was ready to embrace this on a little bit larger scale, there would have been no people or infrastructures that could point the way. Yeah, that's what I think.
Right. Yeah, and neuroscience is so broad. It's just so big. It would have been, I don't know how.
Well, I thank you all for listening and for giving me this opportunity.
Can I jump in with one more quick question?
Sure.
Oh, yes, and I'll go next.
Oh no, Katie first.
Are you sure? Okay, all right. So speaking of broadening more, so my name is Katie McNeil and I work at FASIB, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. Yes,
I'm on your board.
And I've seen your name many times. I started as the program director of our new initiatives DataWorks a couple months ago.
Yes, I'm on the board on that.
I know.
Yes.
And you and I have sort of connected there, but just for the context of everyone else.
Oh, that's right. You just started. Yeah,
it's the initiative starts and then you bring on the director later sometimes. So I think from this perspective, it was a great overview of an array of different things. And I guess one question that I have is just thinking about organizations such as ours, we're the Federation of Scholarly Societies, but other sort of enabling organizations. I was thinking about the discussion that you were having around sort of connecting and coordinating, changing culture is something that is a mission of our initiative. We're really looking to engage with researchers. And so just any either philosophy you have on that or sort of practical suggestions for how can we play the most sort of effective role to connect people together and engage researchers?
So I think the societies have a very important role. The Society for Neuroscience relationship with Neuroinformatics was very rocky in the beginning, which is why I was very surprised that I was asked to give this talk, actually. But I think you've got to get that changing the culture and changing the attitudes is still going to be so important. And just like the societies, right, grew up around the type of communication that needed to happen back then, which is here's a journal and here's how we communicate and this is how we all get together. The new science with fair and openness requires a little something different, right? You're no longer communicating through the journal, you're communicating through other research works, but that has to be valued. Otherwise, right, it's a box checking exercise. And so I think even in the workshops that I've had, you've got a few people who are interested. They're like, well, we kind of have to do this. But when I look at the societies like OHBM and others who have really made impacts on open science, it's a much more active datathon type things, hackathon type things, right? This idea that communally you're all coming together to create something to sort of move things forward. I think starting to figure out how our sort of staid old scientific societies can sort of adapt to improving research practices around, those hackathons and datathons don't just have to be about that. They can be about laboratory practice. They can be about other things, but really engaging them instead of having stuff sort of just given to them saying, look, you need to figure out how to do this. That's what a society is for, right? We are improving our field. And this is how we now have to improve our field. So I think that cultural piece is just absolutely critical, and we need to reach those people. And I think the societies are the places where they, if they're in HBM, they're in INCF, they're already of that field, right? But it's these other domain specific places where we need to have our impact. So it's a little bit, hand wavy, but I think that is the role of the societies. And when those things start to be viewed as important all the way up and down the line, when you start to recognize people for shared data sets, when you start to feature them, right, in newsletters and other places, when data sharing is reuse is valued, that's when I think people will start to engage. That's my hypothesis.
Thank you. Now that makes sense. And I also want to say I really appreciated you didn't necessarily frame it this way, but the concept of sort of short-termism sometimes, sort of thinking of doing what's quickest, but not necessarily the best return long run. So I appreciate that concept.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I know we're sort of past our hour. The question I have, I will say for a beverage some point in time, just so you can prepare for it. The mandate to move to PubMed Central and making all of our publications completely open, sort of followed, a blueprint for this. And that took, for the relatively quote unquote easy, bit of just the text, took years, decade, I don't know, 8 years, long time to implement. This current shift is, again, much more dramatic and it's going to be even more troublesome. And I guess we have to be ready for a long haul on the actual physical transition, through it. And I didn't know if,
yes,
I don't know if drawing that parallel at all is of any use, or that's dangerous to draw that.
I usually put a slide in there saying it took us 350 years even to get to the point of a journal article. Right? That the journal article has evolved over 350 years. We are in a really small space here. And we are not going to get everything right in the beginning. There's going to be missteps. There's going to be things that we find work really well over here, but don't work really, really well over there. But there was a great quote I remember from growing up from Dear Abby, when somebody wrote in and said, I want to go back to college, but I'm in my 40s and I'll be too old when I graduate. And she's like, how old will you be if you don't go to college? You'll still be that age, right? So if you don't get started with these things and you don't do them, what you'll find yourself is just something, time will have passed and you will be in exactly the same position you were before, but you will not have prevented yourself from getting older, right? You would have prevented yourself from having these things happen. So I think we're in the learn by doing phase. But you remember what everybody said when we all started, the skeptics were like, it's too hard, you can't do this, and all that. And they were all right? I mean, we kind of all just said, yeah. But if we don't go in there and try to find something that is tractable, and an example that I will give, which I think is really interesting, we did the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles back in 2014, where we said you have to do these things, right? Data needs to be citable. And you need to make sure that the metadata for a citation persists even after the data underlying it gets removed. And the FAIR data principles say the same thing. Both are agnostic as to how that happens. And in fact, I remember the discussion saying, oh, well, we don't want to put a landing page in there because if we say landing page, some new technology might come along. but almost instantaneously, it got interpreted as landing page because it was something that was doable. It was something that's understandable. And all of a sudden it became, you remember even when Dan Katz said in the advisory committee, it's like, well, if you're a repository, you have to have a landing page that describes the data. And so very quickly, it got interpreted as something that could be done, could be understood, and was almost immediately of value. And I think that is how all of these things are going to start happening. There will be these relatively easy things that people can do that will demonstrate some value, that will be the impetus to move beyond, right, the basics and into something else. And I don't know what that's going to be, but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen, because that's usually what happens when you, I mean, PubMed, right? PubMed Central, it was really difficult in the beginning, but almost very quickly it became a lot easier. The journals are like, okay, we can't fight this, so we're just going to do it for you, right? We're going to do it for you, so you don't have to do it anymore. And that's how I think sort of mandates and practice start to, feed off of each other. But I'll come up with a better answer for my talk. Okay.
Great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Maryann, for that lovely presentation. For those of you who are still here, our next meeting is November 4th. Talia Baram, Mike Yasa, and our own David Keeter will be talking about an imaging study and early life mistreatment, and so some practical applications of some of the ReproNim technologies applied to the real world.
Great.
So thank you again.
No,
and
thank you
see
for
you
the
all.
opportunity. Bye.